I'd like to call the July meeting of the Suffolk Planning Commission to order. I will call on Commissioner Goodman for the invocation.
Let us pray. Father, we say thank you for our city. And also, Father, we speak blessings over our city, over all the officials. Now, Father, as we go into this business session, God, we speak wisdom that we might be able to perform that we need to perform. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. Why don't you call the roll, please?
Yes, sir. Commissioner Bauer?
Here.
Commissioner Creekmore?
Here.
Commissioner Eberwein? Commissioner Edwards? Commissioner Goodman?
Here.
Commissioner Hicks? Vice Chairman Staylor?
Here.
And Chairman Singleton.
Here.
Mr. Chairman, we have a quorum.
Oh, thank you for that. This being the July meeting of the Planning Commission, the organization meeting, at this time I will submit the chair to Mr. Wine for the election of chairman and vice chair.
Yes, sir. Do we have any nominations for chairman?
Mr. Chairman, I would move that Commissioner Singleton be elected chairman for the next 12 months.
A second.
All right, we have a motion for Mr. Singleton to retain chair and a second by Mr. Goodman. I'm going to do this by voice vote. All in favor?
Aye.
All right. Mr. Chairman, congratulations.
We'll now accept nominations for the vice chair.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to place in nomination Mills Taylor, who's for Vice Chairman.
Motion for Mr. Creekmore.
Second that.
Got a section from Commissioner Bauer. If we do this with a voice vote. All in favor?
Aye.
All opposed? No. Good. Congratulations, Mr.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Taylor. Okay. And thanks for your confidence in my ability to carry on another year. Mr. Mills is now being the vice chair. He would serve on the Committee of Ordinance. He would chair that committee. And I've spoken with Commissioners Johnny Edwards, Ms. Anita Hicks, and Kittrell Eberwein, and they would consider continuing their presence on that commission. Okay, next item on our agenda is the minutes from the June meeting. Are there any correction to the minutes? None. It will stand as presented. This afternoon, we have two items on up for public hearings. Public hearings are for 30 minutes, 10 minutes for the proponents, 15 minutes for the opponents, and 5 minutes for rebuttal. This meeting is videotaped and televised for public viewing. The first item on our agenda today is exception request CEX 2023-002, 4351 Apicorn Drive. Mr. Wine, will you read the caption, please?
Yes, sir. This is exception request CEX 2023-002, 4351 Abercorn Drive, submitted by Molly Birch, MAP Environmental Incorporated, applicant on behalf of BCQ Towns LLC, property owner in accordance with Section 31415 of the Unified Development Ordinance to grant an exception to the development criteria and buffer area requirements of the Chesapeake Bay Preservation Area to permit the installation of decks to encroach into the 100-foot RPA buffer, resource protection area buffer rather, on property located at 4351 Abercorn Drive, zoning map 12*31, parcel 3. The affected area is further identified as being located in the Sleepy Hole voting borough, zoned RU residential urban zoning district. The 2035 comprehensive plan designates this area as part of the inner ring suburban use district. When you act on this request, you will be acting on a resolution for a Chesapeake Bay Preservation Area exception, a request for property located at 4351 Abercorn Drive, zoning map 12, parcel 32*3, CEX 2023-002. Staff Planner Grace Brazil will present staff's report.
Thank you. And real quick, before I get into the presentation, I want to bring to your attention one minor revision as it relates to the property owner. Originally on the cover sheet, a small section in the staff report and the resolution, the property owner originally was stated as Bennett's Creek Quarter Towns LLC. It was corrected to BCQ Towns LLC. But I wanted to make everyone aware, and those revised staff reports should be in your seats. But this exception request is to allow for 510 square feet of land disturbance within the 50-foot landward portion of the 100-foot RPA buffer. This is in order to construct 12-foot by 10-foot raised wood decks behind 7 townhouses within the Bennett's Creek Quarter development. So this property is 46 acres in size and is currently under development for the construction of a 181 single-family attached townhouse development known as the Array at Bennett's Creek Quarter. So you do have tidal wetlands that are present along the western and southern portion of the property that are connected to the tidal waters of Bennett's Creek, which does have that 100-foot RPA buffer that does impact the property. The site plan for the townhouses was approved in 2019 and then later amended in 2020. The parcel itself was created in 2020 with a final plat. It is important to note that the property was created, reviewed, and has since started development under the current Chesapeake Bay Preservation Overlay District regulations. So this exhibit on the screen is the overall layout from the site plan that was approved. Some of the townhomes that are to be constructed are right up against that RPA buffer, and at the time of design and review, the development did not take into consideration the decks, so therefore the decks were never included on the site plan. The applicant would now like to include the decks at the rear of each townhouse, which would result in 7 of the decks encroaching within that buffer area, and that's due to 7 of the townhomes just being right on that buffer line. The townhouses, as part of this request, are located within phase 1 and 2 of the development, highlighted in yellow. The orange, or the phase 3 in orange, is not included with this request. So this is the exhibit and buffer restoration that was submitted. It does depict 3 impact areas where the decks will encroach within the buffer and 3 areas for restoration. In total, the applicant proposes to clear 510 square feet of vegetation within the buffer area to construct the decks, and there will be a total of 2.3 square feet of impervious area that is associated with the 4-inch square posts that are required for the footing of the decks. The decks themselves will be constructed over pervious material. It's just going to be the ground cover, so no impervious areas proposed, so no gravel or anything. So this is the zoomed in section of Impact Area 1, which does have the greatest impact to the buffer and includes a portion of 4 decks to be constructed in the buffer, which results in 405 square feet of area to be cleared. And this is the zoomed in portion of Impact Area 2 and 3, which includes 3 decks to encroach within the buffer. It's going to be a portion of those decks, which total a little over 100 square feet in area to be cleared in that buffer. To offset the impacts of the buffer, 2 units of mitigation is required. The applicant has proposed more than the required minimum by providing 3 units of mitigation. So that's essentially 3 large trees, 6 medium trees, and then 9 shrubs. Majority of the vegetation is going to be planted along the buffer line because the entire area is forested. And now to get into the analysis of the exception, Section 31-415 of the UDO provides review criteria when reviewing exception requests. The first is granting the exception will not confer upon the applicant any special privileges that are denied by this ordinance or to other property owners. With this review, similar requests to encroach within the 100-foot RPA buffer to clear either vegetation or to construct a structure on a lot created after March 1st, 2002 has been consistently recommended denial by staff. That's primarily because before March 1st, 2002, the regulations were a little bit different and was a little bit more lenient about certain encroachments. And this lot was created in 2020 under these current regulations. The second is the exception request is not based upon conditions or circumstances that are self-created or self-imposed. Staff does believe the request is self-imposed as the development was not originally designed to incorporate the raised timber decks at the time of site plan, which would have allowed for the overall development and decks to be constructed fully outside of the 100-foot RPA buffer. The third is the exception request is the minimum necessary to afford relief. As previously stated, the approved site plan has demonstrated that a primary dwelling is able to be constructed outside of the buffer and that the requested encroachment could have been avoided if the raised timber decks were included as part of the original design of the site. And then the last two criteria are related to water quality. Overall, the decks as proposed are not expected to endanger water quality as they will be constructed over the ground. There's no impervious material, and they have provided additional mitigation than what's required. So staff has no concern over water quality for this request. But overall, staff finds that this exception request does not satisfy the criteria outlined in section 31-415 of the UDO, as the request is believed to be self-imposed and is not the minimum necessary to afford relief. Therefore, staff recommends denial of exception request CEX 2023 number 2. With that being said, staff has provided recommended conditions outlined in the staff report and resolution should the request be considered with a motion for approval. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Brazil. I will now open the public hearing. Who would like to speak in favor of this request?
Good afternoon, Chairman Singleton, Vice Chairman Staler. Congratulations both on your appointments. Planning Director Wine and members of the Planning Commission. My name is John Napolitano and my address is 1492 South Independence Boulevard. Staff states that they believe this was self-imposed because we started with basically a blank canvas in our rezoning in 2018. While I can't argue with that statement, I can say that not everything is always foreseen. At the rezoning, we were very proud of the fact that we stayed out of the wetlands and the CBPA. But you have to realize that at that time, we had not yet designed the architectural for the townhouses. Why would you spend tens of thousands of dollars not knowing if you're even going to be approved for your rezoning? Yes, we missed the patios. But if everything were perfect, there'd be no need for a variance request because there would never be a variance. Everything would be done perfectly. If you look at the encroachment, it's 510 square feet. And this section of the job is a 16-acre section out of the 40-some acres. That is 0.012% of encroachment. And most of that is pervious material because, as they said, with the decks, the water will go through. Of that, there's only 2.3 square feet of impervious surface in a 16-acre site. That equals 0.00032% of the site. This is just a 4x4 post for the deck on a relatively flat piece of land. The fall to the buffer area is a 1/4 inch per foot. To put that in perspective, an ADA handicap ramp is allowed up to a 1/2 inch per foot. So we're not even at that type of slope. It's very flat land. Now I could make the argument, even based on what staff just said, that the water quality is not being affected. And water quality is what the CBPA is all about. I can make the argument that we should be asking for the concrete decks, but we realized that, we did something, we made a mistake and we needed to do something with it. You know, I served on the CBPA board in Virginia Beach for 6 years, so I do appreciate protecting the environment, and that's why I say the whole point of CBPA is water quality. And because of the fact that we did make a mistake, we were willing to compromise. Instead of asking for the concrete decks, we're asking for wood decks. We do believe that this meets the intent of the CBPA by providing the customer with a patio with the minimum necessary to afford relief. And let's not forget that we are offsetting this not with 2 units of restoration, which is what was required, but 3 units of restoration. So not only are we not asking for concrete for the minimal encroachment, but we're also extending our buffer as well. The last issue that I want to address, as staff has pointed out, there's an area that we are not addressing today, and we will be back probably late fall, early spring for that, and that's phase 3. And the reason for that, staff had recommended that we try to do it all at one time, and I wish I could have because I don't want to come back, but unfortunately the woods are so thick you can't even walk in there at this point, so there was no way for a surveyor to be able to give us an accurate plan with accurate measurements of what we would be asking for. We are getting ready to start to develop that area, and once we clear it, we'll be starting the process to come back. With that, I thank you all for your time and your commitment to the city and ask that you support this application. Thank you, and I'm available, and my environmental consultant is here available as well for any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Napolitano. Is there anyone else to speak in favor of this request? Is there anyone to speak in opposition?
Afternoon, Chairman, Council. My name is Thomas Ryan, 119 Suffolk Meadows Boulevard, Suffolk, Virginia. Been in front of you a number of times on this Bennett's Creek corridor. I know Mr. Napolitano. I'd just like to start out by saying I think he's a great guy. He's also a shrewd businessman, which I have no problem with. That's what he does. So I agree with Planning Department that the exception request does not satisfy the criteria outlined in Section 31415 F5C of the UDO. The request is clearly self-imposed as the original plans, which were approved in 2019, which Mr. Napolitano referred to, that he couldn't get everything done at that time because it cost him tens of thousands of dollars. But they were redone again in 2020, and at that time they were approved again. So he did revisit those plans and didn't include the decks, of which that was approved. Neither time were these decks part of those site plans, and nothing has changed in terms of the actual land or the regulations requiring that these decks are built. So I agree that this is self-imposed. There's nothing that changed with this development that requires these decks to be built. Additionally, and I know you have to keep this to this specific issue, but I think this is very important, so please bear with me here a second. Additionally, Napolitano Homes has been in front of both the Planning Department, Planning Commission, and Council no less than 6 times since the original Bennett's Creek corridor development was initially approved in 2018, requesting a deviation or an exception to this development. And every single time it's been approved. Let's see. There's a clear and definite pattern here, which I think goes something like this. Let's agree to put this request through, the initial one back in 2018, with the basic tenants, which was 111 townhomes by right for this development. And then he came back and requested a deviation to be, that property be rezoned. And now we're at something like 402 units there. He's also requested a deviation to Laylock Lane, which goes right, which is the entrance and exit to this, that was supposed to be 90 feet by requirement, and now it's 60 feet, and that was approved. And then he requested, and I know there was a rezoning here, but he initially was going to proffer money for the schools and came back and proffered that he doesn't need to do that because the zoning's changed. I'll give him that one, but he did have to come in front of planning. Then he came back and then at that time, when he requested another 76 units over the 111, and that was approved. And then at that meeting, which I think was June 2022, he said, and it's on the tape on YouTube, and I've seen it, "I will never come back in front of council again and ask for anything for this development." And he has multiple times, and he gets approved. He was just here in January requesting 186 units that he said he didn't want to build, or he agreed not to build them until the work at Shoulders Hill Road and Bridge Road was completed, okay? And it's not even started yet, and council has approved that recently. So now he's back again, and I just ask you, when does this stop? Really, when does this stop? I understand this is a big development. There's a lot of moving parts to it. But when we're talking about things like wetlands and the resource protection area, we shouldn't be making those decisions, okay? That's an environmental issue. Much more needs to go into this. But he's had a lot of time to review this, to get the plans in, and as he said, he'll be back again. And as somebody who lives right down the street from here, again, I don't want to get into that, but he constantly is coming back and coming back and coming back. That area is a disaster. It is. That road is a disaster. We all know it, you know. And again, he's a stand-up guy. I've met with him personally. He's a good guy, but he's a businessman. He said up here at this exact podium himself, these change, not this, but the last one about not approving those, it doesn't affect him financially. This isn't a financial issue for him. And yeah, I would love to have a deck too. And you know what? Back in 2005, when I moved in my house right down the street from here, I put a request in. It was denied. Why? Because it encroached upon the RPA. And I said, okay, I get it. And I had to change my plans. So, I mean, as a citizen of Suffolk, I was denied an exception for a deck to go into an RPA. And I took it like a man, walked away and said, yeah, I agree. I didn't know. I had no idea. Nobody, real estate agent didn't explain it to me. I don't see why you should be approving this, you know. And with that, I thank you for your time. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you, Mr. Ryan. Is there anyone else in opposition?
Good afternoon, Planning Commission. My name is Selena Thornton. I reside at 1921 Piedmont Road in Suffolk, Virginia. I'm not going to repeat everything that Tom has already presented to you, but I just wanted to take the time to speak in opposition to this. The developer, he threw out a lot of numbers when he came up to speak. Okay. Means nothing, really. But I do want to say, what's next? He already stated he'll be back for phase 3, asking you for more. Well, that'll be up to whatever he presents to you. But I do want you to stand by your word of what the staff presented. They presented to you to deny this request. So I challenge the Planning Commission, hey, when are you going to take the advice of the people that have presented things to you? It's really not up for us to come back and persuade you with our words. It's already written in your report to deny this request. That's all I have for today. Thank you.
Okay, Ms. Northern. Is there anyone else in opposition to this request? None? Rebuttal, Mr. Napolitano?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, Mr. Ryan and I have met, as he said, and, you know, I understand what he's saying, but I don't think, it's just like what business he is in. I don't understand it. Things in these communities do change. He says that I've been back 6 times. He's right. Here's why. The 90-foot right-of-way went to a 60-foot because at the time it was a 90-foot, H.H. Hunt was building in the front with us in cooperation. It was going to be a 90. When H.H. Hunt pulled out, my community only needed a 60-foot right-of-way. And that's why that got changed. I've been back several times over this 111 CO situation because at the time of the rezoning in 2018, when I made that deal, the city produced a schedule of when that road would be complete. They have not held up their end. And it's taken me a long time to get that finally resolved where we have a schedule that the city has agreed to that limits our building. But again, it's not because we wanted to come back, it's because the city didn't hold up their end. Mr. Ryan states that it's not a financial thing. I've never said that. I'm sorry, but it is a financial thing. By not having some of these changes, people would have been out of jobs. The residents living out there would have had exorbitant fees for the recreation areas that we had put in based on the 406 units that were rezoned. It was never just 111. It was rezoned in 2018 for 406 units. We were limited to the 111 COs until Shoulders Hill Road was built, which was supposed to be complete in March of 2022. We're over a year later and they haven't even started it. Why should the residents and taxpayers of this city suffer because the city did not perform? School proffers, I'm paying a school proffer. At the time of my rezoning, 2 brand new schools had just opened. There was no school proffers required for the middle and the elementary. But I'm paying a school proffer for the high school because that was required at that time. I'm paying about $2,000 a unit towards the schools. You know, if we're going to just, whatever staff says, that's what's going to get done, why are you all here? I mean, y'all are here to make decisions. We're talking about 0.00032%. The lady says I'm throwing a lot of numbers. No, sir. I'm throwing facts. Do the math. That's the fact. 0.00032% of an encroachment. As I said, I served on the CBPA board in Virginia Beach for 6 years. CBPA is all about water quality. You can encroach as long as you prove that you are going to improve the water quality. Staff has already stated we are not affecting the water quality and we are doing restoration above and beyond what is required. I feel, yes, am I going to come back? Yes, I told you why I'm coming back. I couldn't do it all at once because we can't walk in the woods. But we will be back, and it will be a minor encroachment then. I'm sure that everybody will be back to try to speak against it. But that's why you guys are here, to make a decision that is reasonable. I'm not asking to put a building in there. I'm just asking for an encroachment with some deck, wood deck, that is reasonable, that will accommodate the citizens who are going to be living there. So again, I ask for your support, and I thank you all for being here today.
Anyone else for rebuttal? Hearing none, I'm going to close the public hearing. Commissioners, questions, comments, or motion?
I'd like to make a comment. I'm glad it was brought up about what our role is here. I think that's really important to, for us to be reminded of that. And if my understanding is correct, we aren't supposed to do the research that goes into this packet. We're not elected officials. And as a citizen of the city of Suffolk, I would expect the planning to deny this. Their job is enforcing, upholding laws, regulations as they stand. Again, this is just my understanding, is that we are here to hear a special exception to something that's already standing. There are different circumstances with any development, different things that affect the entire place. If it were up to me, I mean, I love nature. I would love it if Suffolk stayed as it is and, you know, how I grew up. But I actually did spend some time with the developer and was listened and was explained the very specific encroachment. And it's pretty minimal. And I think that that's our position, is to evaluate this specific instance. And I know some folks may say, well, you give them an inch, they take a mile, or what does this open up for the future? And I would say, we'll see what comes next. I think I'm just specifically looking at this one example for us to review. So I appreciate the chance to say that. Thanks.
Commissioners, any other questions, comments, or a motion?
It don't seem like nobody's going to say it. I make a motion that we pass request CEX 2023-002, I believe, of all the conditions that have been presented. I think I said that right.
Motion for approval?
Yes.
I'll second it.
Then we have a second from Commissioner Bauer.
I want to check with the city attorney, but I believe that would be as amended because we provided you with a revised resolution to reflect the correct ownership.
That's that, what was it? B whatever?
The BCO.
BCQ towns?
Yes.
Of all the correct language.
Okay. Ms. Bauer, you agree with the amendment to the corrections to the, as presented, the BQE towns?
I do.
Okay. Thanks to the attorney for that, and then Mr. Wine. Any discussion on the motion?
We are voting to deny, correct?
No.
Or approve?
Approved.
Okay.
Yes is for approval. Ready to vote?
right.
Call for the vote.
Commissioners, please vote. Mr. Chairman, the motion passes by a vote of 5-0.
Right. There's no other actions required. This body has the approving authority to grant this exception. So, Mr. Napolitano, you have this body's approval going forward. The next item on our agenda is ordinance text amendment OTA 2023-006. Electronic message boards for institution use. Mr. Wine, will you read the caption, please?
Yes, sir. Ordinance text amendment OTA 2023-006, electronic message boards for institutional uses, initiated by the City of Suffolk for amendments to the Code of the City of Suffolk, Chapter 31, Unified Development Ordinance, Article 7, Supplemental Use Regulations, Section 31714, Sign Regulations. The purpose of this text amendment is to update and refine the Code of the City of Suffolk, Chapter 31, Unified Development Ordinance. When you act on this request, you'll be acting on a resolution to present a report and a recommendation to City Council relating to Ordinance Text Amendment OTA 2023-006. I will be making this presentation, so let me go grab the clicker real quick. I promise to be brief here. There's really not a lot to this ordinance text amendment, but the most recent change to the sign regulations occurred probably a little over a year ago, where we did a full overhaul of our sign regulations. As a part of that, there was one small change as it related to message board signs and how they were regulated. And that's when the change time for electronic message boards changed from 1 hour to allow them to change every 60 seconds. Presently, these electronic message board signs, as you see throughout the city, a good example is right down the road at the Cultural Arts Center. They're permitted only in the B2 district, and they have supplemental use standards associated with them. Size limitations, like I said, they can only change once every 60 seconds. They're not allowed to flash, pulse, and the messages must be static, meaning that there's a clean transition. They're not coming in a variety of different ways. There are also brightness limitations. Generally, they're allowed to be a little brighter to accommodate the brightness outside during the daytime, and that needs to be muted down at nighttime so they do not appear much brighter than they do during the day. So as I noted, right now they're only allowed in the B2 district. We're proposing to change that. The proposed text amendment before you all today would allow these signs to be located in any zoning district for institutional uses. So that would be across the city. We do define institutional uses within the UDO. Those include churches, schools, hospitals, residential care facilities, and other public and quasi-public uses. So that is where they would be allowed. This allowing them in all zoning districts wouldn't allow all uses to utilize these, but just those that can be categorized as institutional per that definition within the UDO. This is a minor change. How we accommodated it within the text amendment was modifying the table that we have for permanent signage by allowing these signs in all districts for institutional uses. There were a couple minor changes as it related to the subsections that were impacted by this change. So we had to change a couple subsection lettering to accommodate the supplemental use regulations associated with these for institutional uses. You do have an amended copy in front of you all today that captures some non-material changes to the ordinance text amendment. Once again, it goes back to that subsectioning that I referenced. So with that being said, staff is supportive of this. We particularly hear from churches quite often about their desire to install electronic message boards. We believe that they can be accommodated in all zoning districts because we have supplemental use regulations that work to mitigate the potential negative impacts. And that concludes my presentation.
Okay, thank you, Mr. White.
It's been a while.
Yeah, okay. I will now open the public hearing. Who would like to speak in favor of this request? Additional? Is there anyone here to speak in opposition? Hearing none, close the public hearing. Commissioners, comments, questions, or a motion?
Mr. Chairman, I'll make a motion. We approve ordinance text amendment OTA 2023-006.
Approval.
Second.
A second from Mr. Creekmore.
And once again, it would be appropriate to do as amended because you have an updated version with those subsection changes in front of you.
As amended.
Second on the as amended.
Any discussion on the motion? Why don't you call for the vote, please?
Yes, sir. Commissioners, please vote. Mr. Chairman, the motion is approved by a vote of 5-0.
Thanks staff for their diligence and work, and this will go to City Council on 8/16 for approval, with our motion for approval. Do we have any old business that need to be discussed today? Move move to new business. Staff report on solar update.
Yes, sir. We have been working on some research and modifications to our supplemental use standards as it relates to solar facilities in the city. It's been something we've discussed with the Committee on Ordinances going back to a year ago often. We would talk about it monthly. Since we've had a council retreat on the issue back in March. Further, this has been a topic of discussion at our Agricultural Advisory Committee, which is a committee appointed by City Council. So with that, we've compiled some information for consideration as it relates to potential changes to the supplemental use regulations as it pertains to solar. So I'll hand this back to you. Staff Planner Joshua Bateman will present you with some of these thoughts.
Good afternoon. My name is Josh Bateman. I'm the principal planner in the Department of Planning and Community Development. And this afternoon, I'm going to be presenting to you on some proposed pending changes to our solar energy facility regulations in our Unified Development Ordinance, or UDO. As Mr. Wine noted, this is meant to sort of build upon the presentation that the Planning Commission received several months ago and the City Council received at their retreat that sort of laid out the need for these amendments. So today what I hope to do is before we get to specific amendments or before we get to a public hearing setting where the public is invited to comment, to really give you all a chance to dive into what staff's thinking is on this. And certainly as I go through this, if you have questions or comments or need clarification on something, please feel free to ask. And this is meant to be a sort of an exchange and a give and take. So currently, our zoning requirements on solar energy are codified in Article 7, Section 31724 of the UDO. So they're currently permitted by conditional use permit in the agricultural zoning district, the A, the light industrial, which is our M1, and our heavy industrial, which is our M2, all by conditional use permit. They're not permitted in any other zoning district. In the supplemental use requirements, there are standards that every solar energy facility project has to comply with. And these are just sort of a summary of the key requirements that we look at. For dimensional standards, and by that I mean setbacks and the like, so the minimum setback is 50 feet. The maximum height of these facilities is 25 feet, and the minimum lot area for any project is 5 acres. In terms of installation and design, we require compliance with ANSI standards and state and national codes. We require the electric transmission lines to the point of interconnection to the distribution system that's run by the electrical utility. We require those to be underground. We do require perimeter security fencing, and we have prohibitions on glare, to just name a few of those requirements. In terms of decommissioning, that is a topic that people are really interested in these days. What's going to happen to these facilities at the end of their life? Currently, we require a decommissioning plan, a performance agreement, and bond to ensure removal of the components. Currently, we describe or define discontinuance or abandonment within if something is not continuously in operation for 24 consecutive months, and we require removal in that instance if that's found to be the case within 3 months, and that's dismantling of all of the components of the facility. The requirements in the ordinance say that all components have to be dismantled and removed, and that the roads have to likewise be returned to pre-development condition unless the City Council deems otherwise. But in terms of screening and buffering, this is also a very important topic when it comes to these facilities. Sort of the way they're viewed from public streets or adjacent properties, especially adjacent residents, is a very important issue. Some folks think that they're rather unsightly, but we're going to see some photos here later on in the presentation, and you can judge for yourself. But we currently we have 2 options for screening. One is 2 rows with staggered spacing of unspecified plant material that is 6 feet in height at the time of planting. The second option is 1 row of evergreen trees that are planted 8 feet on center, that are a minimum of 4 feet in height, and then 2 rows of shrubs planted 5 feet on center, in front of that typically, that are at least 2.5 feet in height at the time of planting. And we also require 2 large canopy trees at 20 feet on center and 3 understory trees planted at 15 feet on center. So it's multiple rows of vegetative material that would be required if you went with option 2. Now, as a planner, I'm here to tell you that if I have an option for where to steer applicants in terms of their screening, I'm going to probably go with something that's going to provide the densest buffer requirement and the most specified buffer requirement, rather than going with something like just plant material, because plant material could be grasses, it could be just about anything. So that's sort of a way to summarize our current zoning requirements on solar energy facilities. So I'm not going to spend too much time on this because I know Director Wine and others have been through the Planning Commission with this stuff. So preserving the city's agricultural heritage, as you know, is one of the key themes and one of the key goals of the 2035 Comprehensive Plan. And a preliminary recommendation of the current 2045 plan, that process is currently underway, is to amend the UDO to better mitigate the effects of solar energy facilities on surrounding properties, agricultural uses, and environmental resources. All of the various forces that are operating in order to promote these facilities and encourage their development have been summarized before, so I won't spend too much time on it. But it is codified into law through the Virginia Clean Energy Economy Act, which confers a primary role to Virginia's 2 major electric utilities, that's APCO and Dominion, to meet renewable energy generation standards, and that's a percentage of the amount of energy they produce by a specific date. And these are, like I said, codified into the state law. And that's going to require dramatic expansion of solar energy facilities statewide. Citizens and public officials, as you know, have expressed opposition to the development of solar farms. I've been involved in 3 applications here and at least 3 applications for solar energy facilities at my previous place of employment, which is 1 county over in Isle of Wight County. And at each one of these public hearings, we've heard concerns about the loss of agricultural land, the unsightliness of them, environmental impacts to soil and water, and then overall changes to the rural character and what the landscape looks like and feels like and means to rural Virginians in those localities. So impacts to cultural resources were key in Isle of Wight. Isle of Wight has a lot of historic properties, archaeological sites. So these were things that we heard and we had to address and mitigate through the approval of these projects or not. And then the continued development of large solar farms in rural agricultural areas of the city over time could theoretically pose a threat to the city's rural economy and to its agricultural heritage, which has traditionally been based, as you all know, on farming and forestry. So there's a lot of concern that over time we're going to lose what rural Suffolk is. And you hear that across the South Side, indeed across Virginia. So there is that concern. So in order to address some of these concerns, we have a number of proposed revisions, and these are being presented to you today as sort of a list of best practices. As a planning professional that's been dealing with these for the last 3 years, it doesn't sound like a lot of time, but I've dealt with enough of them to be able to identify which provisions work and are pretty straightforward, and if they're implemented correctly, can lead to major improvements in how these things are cited, how the potential impacts that they have, and the scale of the facilities, which I think are all key considerations. So one thing we want to do is add a clear purpose statement, clarifying the overall goals of our supplemental use requirements in terms of minimizing the effects of solar on nearby homes, farms, scenic view sheds along rural roads, natural and cultural resources, and minimize impacts to public safety. And that's mostly from construction traffic, but it could also be for things like potential for environmental contamination of the soil from the equipment themselves. Imposing an overall maximum cap of 1% of total land in the aggregate that's zoned agricultural permitted to be developed for solar energy facilities. it's been floated around that you can use other metrics. Other localities do use other metrics. For instance, Surrey uses 1%, I think, of total land in the county. Now, Surrey is almost all agricultural land, so it's really not that different of a metric. I know Isle of Wight uses prime agricultural farmland and soils of statewide significance, which are codified terms into Virginia law and have mapped extents. Gets a little bit more complicated because not every you'll have prime agricultural soils and significant soils bisecting and crisscrossing solar farms. Solar farms can work just about anywhere in agricultural settings except for environmentally sensitive lands like in wetlands, steep slopes, floodplains, and the like. So that means they can occupy timberlands, they can occupy farmland, they can occupy pasture, they can occupy cropland. The incentives are such right now, and the industry is booming to such an extent that it can make sense to develop lands of any current land cover type. I think any basis for whatever, however we determine this, needs to meet a couple of criteria. And one is it needs to be relatively simple and straightforward. It needs to be something that we all agree on, has a mapped extent, and is pretty easy for people to understand. And it needs to be something that's fair. One of the things that Isle of Wight did is they put a cap on the overall number of the total number of prime agricultural farmland that these solar facilities in the whole could take up. But when you apply the acreage of a solar farm in its entirety that occupies maybe some farmland and some forestal land, and then apply that to the prime agricultural soils, it doesn't strike me as a particularly equitable way of doing it. And there are going to be effects if you do it that way. If you say, for instance, no solar farm can occupy more than a certain percentage of prime agricultural soils on a given property, or in the aggregate for the city as a whole. Well, we as the planning staff would then have to take any project and figure out, okay, here's how much forestal land it occupies, here's how much farmland it occupies, here's how much prime agricultural farmland it occupies, and then apply that percentage to the prime agricultural farmland in the city as a whole. That's going to have effects where you're going to start to see people move more towards the forestal land and clearing trees to make way for solar farms. So that will have an effect in that way. So you have to be kind of cognizant of that. That's why I think, basing it on agriculturally zoned lands, for one thing, that's a fairly static number. It does move from year to year, but it moves very slowly, if at all. And so basing it on something that's a fairly constant and is fairly straightforward and is in a way that is fair seems like it makes sense from a professional planning standpoint. But that's not set in stone. I mean, we certainly can discuss it and go with whatever basis that you think makes the most sense for determining the basis of that cap. But I will caution you against, I would, if you think the acreage needs to be lower, I would mess with the percentage or tweak the percentage rather than tweaking the thing that you're basing that on. One of the other proposals is to increase setbacks that we currently require. Currently, our setback requirement is 50 feet. I would recommend increasing it to something like 150 feet adjacent to residential properties, maybe 100 feet, but along roads or major roads to 150 feet. I would require enhanced setbacks adjacent to significant environmental and cultural resources, public parks, and other public conservation lands. Some of those lands are not currently protected. Not all of the city is in the Chesapeake Bay Preservation Area currently. So one of the things that we found in some of the rural parts of the south side are these freshwater pecosins, these freshwater wetlands that are not otherwise protected. And if it weren't for the fact that people were proposing large solar facilities where they had to go through an environmental review at the state level, there wouldn't have been the ability for the state to recommend these setbacks from these facilities if we didn't have it codified into our local ordinance. So I also recommend modifying your screening and buffering standards to require a continuous evergreen screen comprised of trees, I'd say a minimum of 2 rows, not less than 6 feet in height, surrounding all sides of a solar facility. I would guarantee it by a 2-year maintenance bond to make sure that the landscaping survives not just the first growing season, but the first couple of growing seasons. And there's a plan in place to replace any vegetation that dies off after 1 or 2 years. I also think we should require the preservation of existing mature forest where it exists on a property whenever forestal lands are cleared for solar. That way, it's a lot easier to preserve existing trees than it is to plant new trees and get them to grow and wait the time that's necessary to get them to grow to the point where they provide the same degree of buffering and visual screening. So, we've had some success with that, with imposing that as a condition, and I think it might be something that we want to codify into our ordinance. Some additional revisions that I think are going to be needed to the current Suffolk requirements is reducing the maximum height. I haven't seen too many instances where these things are 25 feet in height. I think something like 15 feet or maybe even 10 is perfectly acceptable. Look, at full tilt, I haven't seen a system yet that's over about 8 or 9 feet. So I don't think, there's a lot of localities that initially flirted with the notion that there would be livestock grazing underneath these things. I haven't seen that personally. I'm not saying that it can't work, but given concerns over the way these things look and how visually apparent or intrusive they are to surrounding residents, I think you want them lower to the ground and try to put some restrictions on the height of the equipment and the components. I recommend increasing requirements for decommissioning plans, agreements, and bonds to give the city greater ability to use these bonds to dismantle facilities and reclaim sites in the event of discontinuance or abandonment. And what I mean by that is, do you really want to wait for this residents to be calling the zoning office for 24 months saying, look, this thing has been abandoned for the last 18 months. Why can't the city use the bond to dismantle the facility? Other localities have stricter requirements where they require it to be dismantled within 12 months of discontinuance. So that's something to look at as well. I think a good requirement that Isle of Wight has that will address some of the concerns we've heard here at the Planning Commission level is to require baseline and periodic, every 5 years, soil testing to monitor for the potential for contamination from the racking systems and the galvanized posts themselves. If such contamination is detected, that will pick it up, and then, of course, they'll have to remediate for that immediately as soon as that's detected. By replacing systems and removing soil and taking remedial action. I think one of the things that it makes a lot of sense to me is requiring developers to identify deficiencies to public roads in the vicinity of their project. These get a lot of traffic during construction from heavy trucks and equipment that do not typically use rural roads. So one of the things that localities are requiring is for them to do sort of an inspection report, point out where the potholes are, point out where the pavement is chipping away at the edges of the road, and as a sort of like at the beginning of these projects, and then any damage to that is deemed to be caused by the construction traffic during construction, and then there's a requirement in the ordinance that developers have to make those repairs, those specific repairs, and bring it back up to pre-development conditions. They're not responsible for anything that might have existed before, but they are responsible for anything that took place during construction. It's deemed to be caused by them. So also think a noise study makes sense, just to make sure that we already have good performance criteria for noise in our UDO. I think we can maintain those. Those decibel levels certainly make reasonable sense. I think it just makes sense also to require them to do an evaluation to identify any homes that might be located within a certain distance that would cause noise levels in excess of 45 or 50 decibels, whatever the standard is for residential receiving properties. And then I think, it kind of should be common sense, and it should be already codified into law, but it may not be, and that is prohibit solar equipment on sort of the other environmentally significant lands that are not otherwise protected. Believe it or not, I've seen proposals to put solar equipment in 100-year floodplains. Certainly RPAs are protected, but mixed forests, steep slopes, there's other lands types that might make sense to sort of just say, look, these are deemed not suitable for solar developments. You need to protect those areas within by any project and make sure that no solar equipment or any of the components of that system are going in those floodplains, for instance. Some other additional requirements, this is has to do with the information that we would require at the time of conditional use permit application. Currently, we do not have it in our code to require a visual impact analysis, but I found these photo simulations to be very helpful. And certainly the ones we got for the Wilroy Road project were actually pretty well done and pretty professionally done. They certainly cost the applicant considerable money, but they showed us what the project would look like from our flyover that we're constructing. And so I think a requirement is necessary in the code to make sure that we get this for every solar project. And it should be what the project looks like during construction, during construction, and after construction. A road impact plan. Localities call this different things: traffic impact plan, traffic haul route. So this would show the construction traffic routes, and it would be used to assess the condition of local roads pre-construction for use in comparing to impacts and repairs after construction for the purposes of administering the requirement that I noted on the previous slide. Obviously, we need to require a wetland delineation report. We already do, but I think it needs to go a little bit farther and require proof of confirmation from the Army Corps. And the reason why I say that is because, look, any wetland delineation that I've looked at for the last year since I've been in Suffolk can and does get updated from time to time as conditions warrant. And until that preliminary JD has been issued that says, look, you can rely on this wetland delineation and confirmation for the next 5 years, that will give I think the solar industry some assurance that, the city's not going to move the needle or sort of move the goalposts on them when it comes to what land in their property, their subject property, is developable and what is environmentally sensitive land that can't be developed and needs to be preserved. And finally, and I've had considerable success, like I said, in Isle of Wight, is with the archaeological and architectural resource analyses. I don't think that necessarily needs to be required for every project, but whenever you have any part of a project that's located within 500 feet of a National Register of Historic Places property, or even a National Register of Historic Places eligible resource, and that is again, an online map system that we can go to and look at and click on, let's say it's a historic house in the rural area, and determine that it's either on the register or it's eligible for listing. And that report would be issued by a third-party consultant, and that gets reviewed by DHR, and they either concur or don't concur with it. And while their recommendations are advisory, they're pretty strong and tend to persuade applicants to maybe move their project back from the edges of something like a historic cemetery or out of the viewshed of a historic house, as seen from a public street. And then, obviously, we need to require a statement of compliance from the applicant explaining why their project adheres to specific goals, actions, and policies of the comprehensive plan. This is something that's required pursuant to 15.22232 of the Code of Virginia for permit by rule solar projects anyway. It's just not codified in our ordinance. We've been requiring it and going through that process without amending our ordinance to sort of require what it is we're currently doing. Then there's a whole list of optional requirements. I must have gone through about 15 sets of local zoning requirements on solar. And this is a hot button issue throughout the Commonwealth of Virginia. And there's some localities that literally have pages and pages of solar requirements. I don't want to, overdo it, but what I do want to do is give you just sort of a list, a rundown of what I think are sort of the most reasonable ones of those. You could limit, for instance, the height of fencing. You could require the agricultural style fencing along public roads or along public roads of a certain functional class. You could limit the total acreage of any single facility for any single CUP application. You could limit the maximum acreage of one or more facilities on contiguous parcels or within a 2-mile radius. I've seen some localities do a 4-mile radius for which more than one CUP has been issued. So basically what that's saying is, not more than one CUP can be approved for a solar facility within a 4-mile that totals more than a certain acres. And so we have seen some localities go with that requirement. Some localities put a maximum percentage of agricultural land, or maybe farmland containing prime soils, or maybe farmland containing soils of statewide significance that may be converted to solar use for any single project. So that is going to have the effect, as we pointed out, of kind of steering a lot of the acreage towards the forestal lands, and there are implications of doing that as well, but that is something that you can do. I think this is another thing that we're routinely doing that's not currently codified, so it really isn't even optional at this point, and that's the requirement for a neighborhood meeting conducted by the applicant at least 30 days prior to the Planning Commission public hearing, so they can explain their project to the public and get that feedback. A requirement for an environmental document or environmental assessment, which details all of the impacts to natural resources. The wetland delineation report that I mentioned would be a part of that, a component of that, but would also include, so for instance, impacts to what are known as natural heritage resources, for which the Department of Conservation and Recreation in Virginia maintains databases, and require that coordination with the Virginia Department of Conservation and Recreation. DCR tends to be less regulatory. A lot of times their recommendations are very politely given, but I have been able to use those effectively to get them to move things, for instance, 100 feet back or 200 feet back from endangered species habitat or other natural heritage resource areas. And then finally, you see a lot of this, requirements for using only native or pollinator-friendly vegetation, requirements for something called a vegetative management plan, which specifies how often you have to mow it to maintain that sort of, those pollinator plants. That also would spell out how frequently and how the applicant or the operator would be responsible for maintaining that buffer vegetation and replacing it if something dies. And you also see requirements increasingly for the larger solar fields. And a solar field is just a field of solar panels. So a lot of times solar farms are split up into several solar fields. But if there's one large solar field, one of the concerns is that the natural wildlife migration corridors get cut off and are not available to them, and the deer have to wander way around in order to get to their normal place, or they jump the fences and become trapped or injured. So you're seeing some additional requirements for the preserving wildlife corridors. And that's done just by enclosing smaller areas and providing those paths, through those unfenced paths through the field. I spent a little time yesterday, or a couple of days ago, photographing a solar facility that is currently under construction in Isle of Wight. Many of the requirements that I've cited here tonight, or this afternoon rather, were applied to this project. And so this is still under construction. The buffer plantings have not been installed yet, and I thought it provided a really good opportunity to see what these things look like during construction, which is rare. So the pictures on the two photographs on the top, the left and right, were taken from the same place, one looking one direction, one looking the other. And as you can see, around the silt fence, the grass has been allowed to grow up. It's not being mowed. And you can really see that agricultural style fencing that has a lot of wood components, and it does a fairly good job of softening the view of the equipment just in and of itself. On the two lower photographs, there's a little bit of a closer view of that, but I want you to pay particular attention to the one to the far right. That's the far corner of the facility next to a public road. So you have a 75-foot buffer, or excuse me, a 75-foot setback to the fence from the road, and also, and you can't really see it that well, but a 75-foot setback to the tree line. And it's a little bit misleading because the tree that you see there actually sticks out. The tree line is actually a considerable bit back. So one of the things I like about that is, you know, when with the Indian Trail Solar Project, there was some discussion about shade management and the need to clear trees back to make room for so that the direct sunlight can still hit the solar panels. Well, another option is to set these things a little bit back farther. Then you don't have to mess with the natural wood line. You just, you know, the natural forest cover that's adjacent to it doesn't cast shade onto the solar farm in that way. So by having like a 75 or 100-foot setback, I think that would sort of reduce the need for a lot of tree clearing and limbing up along the edges of these facilities. And then these pictures really show, so you can't really see it that well, but the top two pictures, there's a copse of trees along this public road, and there's a historic cemetery there. And one of the things I want you to note is that you don't see any solar equipment in the photograph, in that view. That's because one of the requirements that came out of the archaeological resource study is that they stay, I think it was 100 or 125 feet back from this historic cemetery that was identified in that report. So so people driving by that cemetery, people visiting that cemetery, it won't feel like, you have this modern industrial solar use right on top of your family cemetery. And I think that's a really good requirement. The picture to the lower left is a historic home site that belonged to a doctor. The house has long been removed. But back in those days, people brought their sick family members to the doctor's house, and he treated them right there on the house. And they actually uncovered some grave sites, some unknown grave sites on the site, including a stone that was just laying flat in the grass. And so there was definitely a sort of an archaeological site that needed to be preserved. And I think if you look at that photo, there's a couple of large specimen oaks on that property, and there's corn growing right behind it. And it doesn't, if you were standing right there and I was sitting in my car right there, you wouldn't necessarily know that there was a solar facility right behind it if that's the only thing you saw. And the reason is because if you look at the photo on the lower right, that's on the other side of the corn. The corn is kind of on the right, and then the fence line starts about 75 feet back of that. So that's how, through setbacks, through continued use of the land the way it's historically been used as cropland, even if it's just a 100-foot strip of cropland, it really does a good job to sort of preserve that historic site and that historic setting. So that's all I have for you this afternoon, but certainly be willing to entertain any questions you all have to the best of my ability.
We'll start down on Mr. Creekmore. You got any questions?
The only thing that occurred to me was, and of course, we're talking about overall acreage over 5 acres, I assume, according to one of your slides. But what about existing neighborhoods? People want to put these solar panels up on their roof, residential, and also on there are a number in other areas of schools that are putting these solar panels on roofs. Do we have anything, does the planning department, how is that managed, or is it managed?
May be able to handle that a little bit better being the director of the entire department, but that would be typically a zoning question. They would have to get a permit for that, so I'll let.
Well, yeah. That's what I'm asking. Would it be a permit requirement for something like that if say one of my neighbors or somebody like that wants to put this thing up in their yard? Mm-hmm. To me, it's kind of similar to what we've been through years ago about these antennas, for Wi-Fi and all that, trying to communicate with satellites. But I'm wondering, and I'm wondering about that because it probably is something that if it hasn't come up, it probably will come up because of the cost of electricity and power and all that sort of thing. There are a number of people that are looking into this sort of thing. Do we have any restrictions or anything like that? Or what? I guess the question is, what's the permitting policy right now about those solar panels?
About rooftop solar?
Yes.
So that they are required to get, an electrical permit and a building permit from our department. They're actually keeping us pretty busy right now because I don't know about you all, but I know that I'm solicited weekly for solar by solar companies seeking information about whether we'd like to put them on our roof or not. So they keep us quite busy right now. Those from a use standpoint are accessory to, the permitted residential use, so they're permitted as a matter of right. So from a planning perspective, they're relatively unregulated. From a building code perspective, they are regulated and inspected upon installation.
The same laws that are incentivizing the construction of these large solar farms are also incentivizing private homeowners to get into the solar business and install. I mean, there's been several installations in my neighborhood, so.
Well, on my part, I appreciate your research into this and experience with this in Isle of Wight and now in Suffolk. And I'm sure we'll be looking at more information, official information that will be coming in the form of the UDO and all that sort of thing.
Taylor?
Josh, first of all, thank you and the staff that have spent the amount of time and effort that you have. This is something that's been a hot issue for council members as well as those of us on the Planning Commission since the first one came up. Do have a couple of questions. And I know we discussed this a little bit at the Ordinance Committee. The 1% limitation on agricultural zone project, where would we be right now with what's been approved as a percentage going towards that 1%?
So
Do you know?
that's an excellent question, and I did research that this afternoon, and I believe I do have a tentative answer. So there have been 7 projects totaling 473.65 acres approved to date based on Mr. Wine's map that he produced in that. So if you total up all the acreage of all those solar facilities that are ag zoned, so that would discount the Wilroy Road project because that's in the M2, I believe, zoning district, it would total 473, almost 474 acres. Based on the table in Mr. Wine's presentation to City Council as well, it listed 1,610 acres would be 1% of the total agriculturally zoned land in the city. So if you do the math there, that's about 29%. So we're pushing a third of that acreage. We're about a third of the way to that total. So 474 acres of 1,610 would be 1%. So. And again, that would just simply mean that you would still have the discretion as a planning commission, and the city council would still have discretion to disapprove of projects that don't meet planning goals, that are not cited well, that are not appropriately scaled to what the city is looking for. You would still have your conditional use permit criteria, and if it didn't meet those, you could still deny it. It just simply means that when we get to that percentage, if that's codified into the UDO, you would no longer have the discretion to approve.
Another item that is the buffer zones. In looking at a couple of the existing ones and some others that are in Isle of Wight County, it seems like one of the big problems has been that the planning occurs and then it's put in the ground and then it's gone, and then you come back a couple of months later and particularly during the summer months, it's dried up and you've lost 60–80% of the vegetation that's been put in. And we've got some provisions for the replacement and monitoring of that. Just a thought, is it, and it seems like, and maybe this came from some of the projects we were looking at, that would it be possible, or could it be a consideration that these buffer zones have to have some sort of water? Because a lot of the problems seem that they don't get enough water to, excuse me for that. I'm sorry, I didn't turn it off today. Everybody's supposed to stand up for the Marine Corps hymn, by the way. But following that along, would it be possible, or could we, or maybe we can't, that there could be a requirement that there be some source of water for these areas so that they could get the nourishment, so maybe you don't lose as many plants? Just a thought. I saw something the other day, and I'm always suspect when you see something on Facebook or YouTube or whatever, because it can be falsified. But what it was a fire at a solar facility, and it was the actual units, and there was a quite hot fire, looked like, going on the units, and it was tying into the record heat that we're having and that. When we look at these projects, is the fire department involved, or do we have any history of if these things are a fire risk? Because if they are in the agricultural areas, you could have a sizable fire that could do substantial damage to the surrounding territories.
Yeah, our fire and rescue department absolutely is involved in the review of these facilities. I know there's been discussions about requiring or encouraging dry hydrants in the vicinity of these rural solar facilities so that there is a water source in the event of a fire. I don't think we've gone quite the route of requiring it just yet, but maybe that's something we need to look at with these particular amendments. when there is a suitable water source that can be found. I think your statement about requiring an irrigation source of water, like a well or something like that, for the purposes of watering the buffer plantings is eminently reasonable. So we'll definitely be looking at that. But some more research needs to be done to see what the experience is of some of these other localities with the requirements for things like dry hydrants. There's even been discussion about the stormwater pond sort of doubling as a water source. Problem with that is the stormwater requirements for these facilities is kind of in flux, as we've talked about. And there tend to be dry ponds, so they don't have a permanent source of water, so that may not be a panacea. I am heartened by the fact that if you count the panels themselves as impervious, even disconnected impervious, your stormwater detention requirements are going to go way up. So you're going to have to detain a lot more water on the site, and you may have to do or use wet ponds, at least in part. So I think there's room for exploring that as sort of optional requirements, and if the Planning Commission were in general agreement, I think what you're looking for is eminently reasonable.
One last thing, you know, I guess we can always use the first one that was approved by us and by council is a good example of what not to do as far as a solar farm. But I noticed last time I went by there that a lot of the units were not elevated. And they were evidently, at that time of day, they needed to be elevated. But it was probably 20%, 25% of those units were just flat, so I presume they were inoperable at the time. And I know if it becomes inoperable, but are there any requirements, or maybe that would be from Dominion Power, whoever they have their agreement with, that the facility produce electricity up to the capacity, or if it gets below a certain level that they have to go in there and do some maintenance on these?
It's complicated. And the reason why it's complicated is because I'm not an electrical engineer, and I can't tell you exactly the relationship between these facilities and the grid. I do know that they produce power during the day, and they don't produce power, obviously, during the night. I do know also that they tend to be run or operated by what's known as a SCADA system. Don't ask me to say what the acronym SCADA stands for. I learned that once, but have since forgot it. But basically what it is a computer system that makes sure that the panels and the inverters and everything is optimized in terms of its operation to capture as much electricity and generate as much electricity as possible for generation. And it also has the ability in real time to adjust that output to what the grid can accommodate. So I'm sure that's a very complicated formula, exactly how it is, and I'm not smart enough, unfortunately, to know what those requirements would be, but I'm sure our folks over in electrical engineering would be more than happy to try to explain it to someone like me.
Josh, that's all I've got, and I once again just want to thank you for the amount of work that you put into this, plus your staff that supported you in this, because I think we all need to improve the UDO requirements for the solar farms, and I think some of these things sound fantastic to me, so thank you again.
Yes, sir.
Yes, exceptional presentation. I hope that, I'm assuming we'll have access to it through online. Great. I think looking at the percent versus total acreage is very smart. One reason being, from what I've learned about companies pursuing solar, is that they are looking for land with a proximity to a substation. That's extremely important. So that you may be getting into different zones, not just ag. The buffering, I thought it was really good that you brought up several different concerns: safety and the environmental, the dismantling timeline. The one thing was brought up was the height and how you haven't seen much. There haven't been many examples of livestock being able to graze. There was a company I've heard of out of North Carolina that they have been successful with that, and they utilize local farmers. And again, this was just in a presentation that I saw, but they utilize local farmers to help with that, and also beekeeping and things of that nature. So I'd be excited to see something like that come along. But excellent presentation. Thank you.
And we probably just need more examples. I just haven't personally seen anyone avail themselves of that. It'd be really interesting to see, especially for something like goats or something like that, or sheep. But I haven't in my experience yet encountered anybody that goes, yeah, I can't wait to put sheep underneath of a solar system. Most of the time what I hear is that people don't want to see them from their house, and so we try to keep them as low to the ground as possible. And they're not naturally much taller than, say, a typical security fence. Even at full tilt, they're only about 9 feet. So,
Mr. Goodman? You good? Okay. Most of the question I had was been answered. I spent 33 years in the electrical field, and I know all about distribution and pockets, and it's complicated, as you said before. But the question that I have is, how do you determine a solar facility with all the buffers back in the woods is being discontinued, not in use?
even in rural areas, there are people, as you know, Mr. Chairman, and there are people that live around these things no matter, I remember.
They don't have the hum anymore?
I remember listening to a webinar, and the best practice was the best solar facility is located near no one, visible to no one, visible from no public streets. It is out of sight, out of mind. But I haven't found a solar facility that I've been involved in that is completely 100% out of sight, out of mind. There may be pieces of it or portions of it that are. But there are people in rural areas, and the people are going to tell you if for instance, God forbid, there's a storm or hurricane or something like that, and the components get damaged, and the solar operator is slow to make those repairs, and it sits idle for a period of time. We're going to hear about it in the zoning department. I have no doubt about that. The residents of Suffolk are going to keep those kind of projects honest. And so I just think right now, and then there are some other localities that allow for them to be discontinued for or cease operating for 24 consecutive months before they're considered abandoned. But we didn't require that in Isle of Wight. I think we were down to like 9 months or something like that, or maybe even 6 months. It's different if they're making a good faith effort to make repairs, or if they're making a good faith effort to replace equipment, because as we've learned, the solar equipment themselves operates at a peak efficiency initially, and then the efficiency begins to fall off. What I've been told by solar energy representatives, and I have no way of knowing if this is true or not until I go try to buy some, but there's a secondary market for utility scale solar equipment that's reached an age of 25 to 35 years and is operating at an efficiency of less than, let's say, 70 or 75%. And I can't remember what that exact figure was. There's a secondary market where people like me can buy those systems for use in my home at a reduced rate, because 70, 75% might not work for the electric utility because they have to meet regulatory requirements. But for me, empowering my home or certain systems in my home, it's perfectly acceptable. So basically where I'm going with that is if they're wholesale replacing equipment at the 25-year mark, I don't think the city can come in and say, you know what, you've ceased operating for, so we have to add in and program in those caveats for when they're replacing equipment wholesale, and maybe only operating part of the facility, or even shutting it down for a period of time in order to upgrade their equipment, which happens with cell towers, it happens with these, I'm sure. So I guess one of the ways that we could find out is that they could tell us, pursuant to an agreement that they enter into with us. That'd be one way. But I think being a little bit more realistic and maybe even a little bit cynical, the residents out there that live near it are gonna tell us when it's not doing what it's supposed to be doing.
Thank you, Mr. Bateman. You did a very good job, banging up job, and you did your research.
Yes, sir.
And Mr. Staylor, stand by, because this will be coming to planning ordinance soon.
Thank you.
Thanks again.
We're ready, Mr. Chairman.
Okay. The next item we have is the city council meetings of June 21st. Mr. Wine?
Yes, sir. We had two items go before City Council at their June 21st meeting. First was a conditional use permit, the Sojourn Fermentory, to do live entertainment. That was approved with the staff recommended conditions, and there was an ordinance text amendment to allow for non-conforming uses to exceed 50% of their overall value without the need for a conditional use permit, and that passed.
We had no preliminary plats, and we have a commissioner comments, and I think Mrs. Taylor has a comment you would like to make.
Yes, sir, Mr. Chairman. Had some discussion with Mr. Wynn concerning some things that need to be considered, and so I would like to make a motion that to direct the planning staff to draft language that would create supplemental use standards for industrial development in the M1 and M2 zoning districts when adjacent to residential districts, institutional uses, or public recreation uses.
That's a motion.
That's a motion.
Do I hear a second?
I'll second.
Okay. Can we, discussion and motion? Can we have this with a voice vote? All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Okay. No one is opposed, so the motion carries. Does any commissioner have any other comments they want to make?
Mr. Chairman, I just want to thank my fellow members of the Planning Commission for honoring me with the vice chairmanship, and I do hope that I'm just a casual observer of the chairman for the entire year. Thank you.
And I would like to add my comments also. Thanks for your compliment, your confidence in me doing this job. I think I got it down. I'm getting it down now. It was a great transition. And I'd like to make one note that the Virginia chapter of the American Planning Association meeting was last week over in Roanoke, and I know the staff went. And one commissioner, Commissioner Hicks, attended that. And I was, she's not here tonight. I want to maybe she'll make some comments on what she gained from that. But other than that, if there's no other comments, we'll stand adjourned.